Okay, this is now another further recording, which is meant to be a sort of addendum to the last 2.5 hour conglomerate recording that I made on borderline, describing borderline as a primary psychopathic entity that, in some sense, well, I mean, I don't know how they even, what they mean by a secondary psychopath. In some sense, even their description of it being a secondary psychopath, that the psychopathy rears its head in a situational sense, but I think I've accurately explained how that's because it is the undergirding structure. It is actually it's not this side event. It is the underpinning um, edifice. Um, and and the narcissistic element in borderline, in some sense, is this borderlines are psychopaths that are secondary narcissists. That's basically my description of it. And in some sense, everyone has this natural, let's say, inclination to believe or to think that obviously the narcissistic element, or the inner child, the unconscious thing, is ontologically prior, and therefore it is the ontologically um, source of the borderline, where it's not so. No, they are actually just the same as psychopaths. Now, I wanted to get into so essentially the thing that makes, okay, because the thing that also confuses that is that when you have, let's say, narcissists who are just narcissistic, sorry, that are just narcissistic psychopaths, or narcissists with psychopathic features. Now, the narcissists with psychopathic features, I think I've also nicely described what's going on there, but essentially, they are still functionally distinct. The narcissist is still functionally distinct from um, from someone who is, let's say, firm in their antisocial personality disorder, that is the sort of the central um, operating mechanism that the personality complex is fundamentally prone to. Um, okay, so I just wanted to explore psychopaths. What did I want to explore? So the variance and the spectrum of variation that you get within particular, let's say, styles of pathology, which seem to sort of be in the same wheelhouse, the same pigeonhole, that grouping, as it were, the variety that they have is in the variety of how they treat the sides of the mind that don't correspond to them. I think borderlines are actually very consistent in their pathology, because in some sense the content is all different, and even the maneuvering is unique, and what they're actually leveraging in terms of the form that it takes is a unique um, compounding compounded invention, as it were. But the thing that characterizes each personality disorder is in how it treats the sides of the mind that that the structures don't, that the operative structures that characterize that personality disorder, how it treats the sides of the mind that don't have those structures. That, in some sense, is the source of the variation. So in terms of the narcissist, um, they can be seen to all have the same abstract style of treatment of the subconscious. And then essentially the complication of the narcissist is the psychopathic narcissist that has this transient psychopathy as a kind of cloud event, as a kind of weather event, um, that almost is unlocked by a certain condition of contexts, that sort of all the stars are in alignment, and that sort of unlocks the kind of a kind of transient seat of consciousness in the ego function. Okay, I described it better when I was going over it, but anyway, and then when I was going over it before in the last recordings. Okay, and then the psychopath, in some sense, is slightly different because the psychopath has such a rigid structure between the inner child and the ego function that the subconscious then just becomes a kind of a, a very shallow form of exposure in which it's just trying to sort of extract a form of symmetrical correlated parallel, where it's just trying to essentially the straight line of structure that's a sort of metaphor, whatever structure exists between the ego function and the inner child, and the straight line that connects them, it's just that straightness wants is what they want to sort of artistically express in terms of their shallow the shallow facility that the subconscious offers them in some sense. And so they don't treat the subconscious with any sort of reverence in some sense. It's just like, well, that's the only thing that, so it's like an adult swimmer that doesn't ever get to go to an Olympic sized swimming pool and has to deal with the sort of a kiddie swimming pool. That's the psychopath, but they're bored and there's nothing else to do, so they go to the kiddie swimming pool. So in some sense, psychopaths in that sense are much easier to clump and classify as being obviously of the same genre, obviously of the same genus of behavior, as it were. But then obviously if you're at the kiddie swimming pool and then you say that you're going to do a maneuver, a diving maneuver or a swimming maneuver, and then somehow you don't pull it off, and then the little children in the kiddie swimming area are making fun of you, well, then you've got an adult being frustrated or being aggravated by people who it considers to be far his junior. So then the psychopath is wont to be vindictive in order to sort of re I don't want a word that starts with re, I guess, but essentially to sort of recoalesce the conservation of their own mastery, as it were, because was just meant to be an exercise in parallel, symmetrical verification and in creating a correlate that was a kind of a pale thoroughfare, a pale adventure, a very tiny adventure of essentially as an ode to their magnificent structure and which in some sense is all concocted and locked into a kind of, because in some sense they believe that they are being the most effective that any human being can be within their tracking of the system, as it were. They believe that they are at the height of efficiency, in some sense. They might not communicate it to themselves even in that sense, but they see themselves as maximal animals, that they have worked out what it is, what the animal of they are, and then they are just maximally sort of gearing that animal to perform in that optimal arena, in that optimal set of conditioning, as it were, because they don't have the fluid, proper interrelatedness that the subconscious should have. It's just a pale reflection, in some sense. It's a pale. It's not a pale reflection in the sense that the narcissist is looking for a reflection in the subconscious because it doesn't have a line. It only has a point. So it doesn't. The narcissist doesn't have a line to the ego function, and then between that tethering of that line needs to be replicated in the subconscious. They don't have a line, they only have a point. They have points that they need to see, sort of, in some sense, they need other people to sort of to help suggest what that line is or something like that, because they can't make lines themselves. They can only make other people sort of by sort of external interference and external disorder, or watching other people organize around them, they are sort of intimating what those lines to the ego function would be. And that's the sort of the outline that they want. They need that energy, as it were, in order to revivify, or in order to feel alive in some sense. Because the narcissist, in some sense, is in a form of dormancy if they don't have narcissistic supply, sort of animating and filling in the lacuna that they have in terms of their other sides of the mind, are gaps that need to be stocked by this external drama and this external locus of control. Now, in some sense, the borderline has taken that external drama and they've inculcated it into a psychopathic um, chess game, as it were, where they are holding themselves out to be a kind of failed narcissist, but really that's just the lure, that's just the sort of the hook, um, to capture and to hook into, um, and then obviously it's weird because it's almost grating against itself. And the psychopath in the borderline is using the narcissist as both the fall guy, as the patsy, and as the bait, and as the henchman. So the narcissist in the borderline is just a henchman, and it's sort of a henchman that is meant to fall on its sword, because that creates more confounding, convoluted subject matter in order to keep the sort of to keep as an insulating factor for the psychopath to continue doing that game and just recycling that. And in some sense, the narcissist, in some sense, is so badly off in that system that it has to actually find a target that it can eventually dump. The failed narcissist component of the psychopath is only a failure in the lead up, but in the crescendo and in the aftermath, it's actually meant to export that failure onto their target. And when the target accepts that failure as their own and owns that failure in the collective accountability, then the true machination of the psychopath and the borderline fully manifests in some sense, because then they've got an amalgamated entity where they they have merged their subconscious with the target, but they still get to expose them to the glass house um, ex, um, exhibitionism that keeps their target prone to pandering to them, because they can essentially use the play of the exhibition of the glass house disorder to coercively suggest exactly the kind of amelioration needed in order to dissuade the negative emotion. So in some sense, they are using their internal negative emotion within the glass house in order to conduct, in order to induce compliance and knee-jerk facilitation, or whatever. The problem is that this is obviously so exhaustive that the narcissistic component of this psychopathic structure, because it is preeminently a psychopathic structure, but the narcissistic component is so utterly um, confabulated in some sense. It's so utterly um, it's so exhausting. It's so acrimonious. Um, and this again, they need to actually, they're sort of like ticking time bombs. They need to create a kind of systemic confusion and a systemic external, they work to undermine the structure in order to create an exterior drama that they can hide this internal economy of their subversiveness in some sense. So they need to create a more hectic environmental problem in order to disguise the problem that they are trying to essentially counterfeitly pass off on somebody else. And essentially, the best description I've come up with, essentially their end game is what I would call the House of Mirrors. And so essentially they are just propositioning people to try and get into this House of Mirrors scheme that they have. They just want the House of Mirrors deployed, um, where it's safe, where it becomes a safe space in order to openly perpetrate this, and the culture has already sort of customized itself to being to facilitating this. Okay, now the issue that I wanted to get into is I wanted to talk more about just pure psychopathy. So psychopathy, what was the thing that I wanted to bring up about psychopathy? There was an important distinction that I had left out that I wanted to supplement with this recording now, and now I've forgotten it. Oh, okay, yeah, yeah. So what I wanted to, because I'm trying to amend what I said about not a, I don't need to amend it. I need to add to it. It's not what I said was not wrong, but it was certainly incomplete. So when I say about the responsibility and the accountability being simultaneous, and that being the only mark of real progress, that they are simultaneously responsible and accountable. And then I tried to get into some of the philosophical issue of how to define that, because essentially they can very, in a very delicate way, it's very easy to sort of pretend that, and they do sort of always create good counterfeits that are in effect just more narcissistic ploys. Um, but anyway, the thing that I wanted to say was essentially when I said that they need to have accountability and responsibility, and that's on the line of rehabilitating the psychopath element. That's in working on the psychopathic element. That the psychopathic element needs to be stabilized with responsibility and accountability, which is another way of saying also rebuke, and actually that it must be capable of burdening responsibility and accountability actively simultaneously. And I described that with the subconscious and the ego function. That the ego function has epistemic accountability, and the subconscious has ontological responsibility, active ontological responsibility. And now the thing that I need to amend about saying that is like a glove. It still needs to be, the glove needs to be actively motivated to be, it needs to be, that glove needs to be properly functional, and it needs to be robust in some sense. But the glove needs to be filled by a hand, and that hand is the hand of the inner child. But don't try to fill it with the hand of the inner child until the glove is there. The glove must already be a very clear implement, a very clear entity. So, and this is the curse of the psychopath. That the psychopath, if they ever wanted to become a real person, as it were, or a genuine integrated person, the problem is that their ego function, in some sense, developed this whatever. And I need to talk about this more as well when I talk about psychopaths independently. But essentially, the psychopath. The problem is that they have the seat of consciousness is very clearly in the ego function. Okay. Um, And so the ego function is already overly developed in some sense. Now this is confusing in some sense in the borderline case, because the borderline, again, I don't want to take it from this angle, but because there are other things that I need to say around this issue, and that's going to convolute it too much. But let me just say that then it's important that the glove be mended and the glove be corrected, as it were, that the glove be fashioned in a technical sense properly, and then the inner child can grow into the glove. But the glove must, the structure of the glove, the ethic of the glove, the morality in some sense of the glove needs actually to be perfected, as it were, or it needs at least to be stabilized, and it needs to be understood on a kind of on an ego function level, on the epistemological analysis, that has to be now. What's my point? Now, in some sense, having such a finely worked glove can be intimidating to the inner child, because the inner child, in some sense, won't fit in that glove and won't have the resources. That it won't have the. It won't fill it up. Um, and it will knock against that structure. And in some sense, this is the curse of the psychopath, is that they're top heavy. Um, in terms of their ego function, obviously. They're probably better words. That my vocabulary fails me. Anyway, okay, let me get to that nuanced point that I was dancing around that I didn't go into. So the glove will be intimidating to the inner child, and I don't even want to describe that too much, because in some sense the glove must be watertight, though. The glove must be really perfected, because in some sense, if you do that, then the inner child can, in its juvenile fashion, can eventually generate its own maturity that will fit inside the glove. So in some sense, you've already got the outline, but you don't have the fill, you don't have the substance. But that substance, with the glove already there, in some sense, it will take years perhaps to fill it up, but it will, to practice the articulation of the glove, and to have the grasp of the inner child to eventually sort of, um, anyway. So I mean, the problem is in some sense that the psychopath is fundamentally a precocious type. That, I think, that's the best metaphor, I think, of describing the pathology that is psychopathy, is that it is this sort of this adult, this fully adult childish precociousness. Anyway, um, uh, what's the weird point that I wanted to bring up? The weird point is to do with, something about psychopaths and subconsciousnesses. Yeah, so borderlines have, in some sense, in the way that you can imagine that a psychopath is autistic. Um, it's a very insulated form of autism that's hard to see from the outside. In some sense, they're distant because they're contending with their own inner child, that they have encapsulated their inner child in their ego function. They have diminutized their inner child inside their ego function. And in some sense, borderline slightly complicates that general psychopathic feature, because as the same way that the narcissist encapsulates the subconscious, or the facility of the subconscious they replicate within their sandbox of the inner child, the ego function of the borderline has created a model of the inner child inside the ego function. And then with inside that construct, the inner child has created a construct of the subconscious. And that is really the best way to understand the pathology of the borderline as well. That is essentially, that is why their unconscious or inner child has this radical cycling adaptive invention, that it can just reinvent itself, that it just renames itself instantly, because it's the pattern between those three levels. It's the pattern between the ego function, which is, which is its fundamental platform, as it were, and then the replica of the inner child, and then that replica of the inner child has a replica of the subconscious inside of it. And the ego function just wants they just want symmetry between these three layers. They just, because this whole structure is meant to be a structure of control, of power, of a kind of purveyorship, a psychopathic purveyorship, in the same way that psychopaths are purveyors of the subconscious. But at least when psychopaths are purveyors of the subconscious, although they have the power also to radically reorder their inner child, in the same way that a borderline reinvents itself, a psychopaths are only doing that because, to show their mastery of the inner child, because they might want to manipulate someone, and they might want to sort of, because they're bored and they are creating sort of some interesting intrigue for themselves in toying with the kiddies around the pool or whatever. And there's this diver who could be swimming in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, but there are none. There's only the kiddies pool, so that's all he has to contend with. And yes, he's going to be bored, but there's nothing else to do. So the psychopath can emulate different swimming techniques. He can emulate different inner child structures, but he has his own inner child structure as well, which in some sense is kind of in a stalemate, which is sort of a bit, which is locked into a contention, which leads into this being the only outlet, the only sort of operative paradigm to work in. And the borderline has the same psychopathic existential metaphysic. It's just that they have the added complication that because they not only have an unconscious, they don't only just have an inner child, but their inner child also is operating a subconscious mask. And so it's actually an added step above psychopathy, that essentially psychopathy, there is a, let's say, an internal intention in the ego function to not completely instrumentalize the inner child, whereas the borderline has decided to fully instrumentalize the inner child. And it is that decision that has fundamentally spurned the structures of the mind itself into this gamified chess game, which has the potential of having no extrication. It has the potential of never stopping in some sense, because how could you even tell them, okay, no, actually just make a glove first and then make the inner child fit the glove, and deal with the bad faith of the inner child? Because essentially the problem is that it is an issue of it's that they can always just continually manufacture more inner child bad faith. At least an ordinary psychopath in some sense will give you the runaround, will give you metaphors because they're lost themselves. The borderline has also lost themselves, but they've also sort of thrown away the key in a kind of in a spiteful way as well, in that they have no interest. Uh, that when they committed themselves to this plan in some sense, and in some sense, this is the problem: is that you cannot use the structure, many structures of the false ego can be leveraged to compel the person, or at least to implore the person, to make progress in the direction of maturity. Because you can say to yourself, you're not meeting your own objective. That's not true for the borderline. The borderline is a true alternative. The borderline is committed to their pathology, and they actually need a new motivation in order to stop. And there's no way to compel such a motivation. It has to be their own decision. This is the fundamental problem with treating borderline, is that they don't want to get better. It's a problem of a lack of motivation. Yes, you can look. I don't want to put clinicians off the hook, because the truth is that these they don't understand these features as they should. And I would even say that some of these things that I've heard some Vakhtins say, I consider to be counterproductive, because the more sympathy that you give to the borderline, to the narcissistic component, the more you're letting the psychopathic substrate scot free. Okay, so anyway, that's why I keep on sort of rehashing that, because it doesn't sense me. Um, so when you're dealing with with the psychopath, you're dealing with a solipsist. You're dealing with someone who they'll play this game where they'll be, give me a reason why I shouldn't do what I'm doing, and you have to be very careful, because you can't. They have to come up with the reason. You can give them an example of a reason, but essentially, I mean, that's just part of. They're just trying to attach to your subconscious. Um, they're essentially they've already got you on the line. They've got you on the hook. Essentially, then everything is under your integrity, under your accountability. It's the reason why they want somebody else to give them a reason, is because then they can use essentially their ego function, epistemological accountability, to shift the narrative. Essentially, whatever they fail to do as a verb in terms of their subconscious. They can get uh, the ego functions accountability ledger to narrate as being conditioned as an imposition by some external countervailing force or whatever. So essentially, they've got this. They've actually got sort of an oxymoronical machine where they've got an internal locus of control that is dependent on an external locus of control. And there are two methods of arriving at that juncture. And the two methods are that they will claim accountability, but then they will claim it as part of a past identity that they used to have. So they will show that they can duplicate real information, that they can track real information in terms of accountability, and this is really proves that they're psychopaths, is because they can say yes, yes, yes. They are effectively, they will say I was accountable, or I was sorry, they'll say like I was responsible, and look how accountable I'm being because I'm telling you the truth about reality. So I'm telling you that I was accountable. Sorry, that I was responsible. But they won't say I am responsible. So in being accountable in the present, they are saying I was responsible. They never say both of them at the same. They never say I am accountable and I am responsible. It's always I am accountable and I was responsible. Or they say, um, and this is where they very overtly express where the psychopathic deployment fully happens is when they say, okay, well, now I am being responsible and I was being accountable, but you don't get, I don't, I don't get to share a window of my accountability with you because you weren't accepting the other version. So now I have that resentful streak. I have that antagonistic streak, and they're two variants of exactly the same. They're two sides of the exact same coin, and this is the constant, let's say, oscillate. This is the final defense mechanism, as it were, because they don't want to make the glove. They don't want to make the glove of the active responsibility and the present accountability. They don't want those things to ever be conjoined, um, because then it would imply essentially that the project of this virtual inner child and its fictitious subconscious glass house defense is all is all for the scrap heap, or is all fundamentally deceitful, which it is. It is. It's a psychopathic form of deceit, um, which is why I'm so incensed whenever I hear people essentially trying to, what's the word, play it up as being a kind of humanistic element or something like that. Okay, I think that now finally covers all of it. I think I've gone back. Yeah, so there was just something that I wanted to maybe just talk about psychopaths in isolation. And maybe neaten up some things about narcissistic psychopathy, but I think that's all quite insightful. I think I've just laid it all out actually very clearly, and that's everything that's potting. Probably could have been more eloquent, but anyway. Some of these models might be worth examining in terms of then re-explaining other properties or other behavioral elements in borderline presentation. Um, in some sense, you can probably get a lot out of the idea that they are a psychopath, that their ego function is encapsulating a model of their inner child, and then that model of that inner child has its own replica of the subconscious. And so then you can understand that the subconscious component of that, especially as it's sort of an amalgamated subconscious that's amalgamated with the inner child, and so the inner child doppelganger or invention, which is also capable of being reinvented on the fly, um, being orchestrated by the ego function itself. Um, in some sense, even if it might want to stabilize the entities, these replica entities within itself, it might, even if it wants to sort of keep them as persistent roles that it's using to facilitate its control of the environment or its control of the psychology that it's attached to. In some sense, it can't even prove it has. Although I've described it as a psychopath, it has that idea where it's sort of it has waded into the pool, it has waded into the kiddie's pool, and now it's sort of its integrity is on the line. That if it can't sort of delude the other children in the vicinity to sort of to adulate or to sort of fawn or to pander to the borderline sense of mastery or grandiosity or at least to sort of to validate whatever the current content of the inner child is. If it doesn't, if the subtextual environment or context does not verify that presentation of the current presentation or the current form of that replica of the inner child, then essentially they've got sort of big daddy psycho and psychopathic ego function to sort of be the cajoling voice in the clouds to sort of help to narrate, so in some sense they need interlocutors, they need targets that are prone to that kind of ego function cajoling in some sense, so that they're working the manipulation from both ends. They are both the actor and the director. The ego function is the director, the inner child is essentially the actor, and the actor is capable of reframing its role on the fly. Sort of is what do you call it, theatre sports. So they've got this theatre sports inner child, right? And then that theatre sports inner child is coming compacted with its own subtextual sort of projection and implicit, sort of it comes along with this prepackaged game that it just wants to be able to assume. It just wants to be able to sort of deploy and process things on the basis thereof, to sort of and so it's sort of this is why it needs cultures that are very convoluted and conducive to allowing people to essentially use conventional symbolism and let's say you know very superficial cultures, like identity politics kind of thinking, that kind of mob mentality, that kind of where it's easy to just sort of trigger into a trope that then must be reified by people, that people are just expected, that they must be impressed and imprinted on by something because it has the correct amount of sort of superficial um, resonance with some kind of script or narrative. So the ego function is leveraging these half-baked, let's say, grooves in culture, as it were, and it's also craftily backing people against those, because essentially those are the kind of the asymmetrical terrain that allow them to better play chess. So they can pretend that they're playing chess and that the board is even, is a level playing field on their chess game, but because essentially, uh, because culture itself has its own topography and terrain, um, they map their chessboard onto that topography, and then essentially they're using the narrative direction being voiced by the ego function, cajoling at the right amount of time, as well as playing a kind of naive inner child with the glass house exhibitionism of some internal turmoil or negative emotion, which then has to be catered to. Um, Otherwise, the other person is a monster for not essentially facilitating or helping to process or to burden that. Okay, so anyway, what I was trying to get into here is just the understanding that essentially the subconscious element, the feeling body element, the feeling body mask, is the most, let's say, variable component of this machinery. It's sort of, it's gone, it flies quickly, it cycles through a whole myriad of different, sort of valences. Uh, uh, and the inner child itself is prone to a revision, a meta-orchestrated revision by the ego function itself. So is being planned, or administered in some sense, is being framed, and therefore, in some sense, it's interesting because the inner child also seems to have a kind of independent existence to the ego function in some sense, but because but that independent existence is really quite a virtual one, and it has to do with the current subconscious presentation, as it were. And in some sense, it gets locked into a certain pattern that essentially, because the subconscious manifestation, although it's right at the end product of this complicated machination or whatever, is has to sort of finish with its set of transitions, because essentially those transitions were already pre-programmed into the inner child, and that subroutine needs to sort of be completed. That task has to be finished. So the task of the inner child, essentially, if it's decided that actually it needs to do another thing, the next inner child program is already preloaded, but the last task hasn't been finished, and that has to run its course. And then you can get sort of, it gets flustered because, sorry, just interrupt. It gets flustered because, in that interim, where it's already got stock of the next program that it wants to run, in the end bit of finishing off a task, so that it can sort of lean into the next inner child program. Maybe some advent happens, and now they have to reassess the program that they were about to load. And in some sense, because of, let's say, this very special form of autism, because in some sense, this is how all they essentially, the whole appeal of this personality style, or personality disorder, is that the idea is that you don't have to do anything other than maintain this tower, this stack. You don't have to do anything else other than sort of just keep on feeding this same machine, the same thing. Now, the machine itself does have, let's say, structural deficits, and in some sense, I was going to get on to sort of trying to describe this, although it's more of a kind of geometric metaphor. But essentially, because they've got this sort of this internal feedback and internal triangulation, and because essentially it's impossible to actually balance it, it's impossible to sort of keep this functioning well. The only way to do it is essentially to have a subconscious manifestation which is at the top of the tower, um, and essentially use that as your excuse for doing anything. The subconscious, let's say, must become, let's say, the captain of the ship, but it can't do that very well because it's being replaced all the time. It has to sort of update itself, so it has to find a way of justifying its change. So the only way it can do that is by associating with somebody else's subconscious, where it can offlay that accountability, where it can sort of shunt that ontological accountability for that change. And so it's constantly looking for someone that it can do that, um, that will facilitate that. Um, what is the other thing? So the other things, and this issue is more pronounced when you attack the middle of the structure, when you attack the inner child, um, or when you make the inner child defunct, or when you are treating the borderline in such a way so as they don't have this one-way flow of, essentially, in some sense, the only part of the borderline that is meant to be vulnerable or appear vulnerable is the subconscious. And if they get people to sort of honor playing with that lure, that hook, then essentially it doesn't matter if the hook is sacrificed, as long as the inner child, in some sense, can continue to just have this one-way exhibition of the glass house defense. And then they get to populate that what's on show in that exhibition, and in order to sort of control the subtext of the other person's subconscious, and eventually get them to burden themselves with the blame that is essentially being projected from the borderline. And this is all affected by the inner child. This is not even being affected by um, the ego function. In some sense, the ego function is just there to, like, sort of utterly bring the sort of the knife, the gun, to a I can't remember what the phrase is, but essentially the ego function is just there to sort of to underwrite that this must happen, that this must take place, and if it doesn't, then it can sort of escalate and sort of try to shake the very framework and the very foundation, in some sense. Um, I think this is what is actually being explored in Medea, but as well. But anyway, I think Medea was probably borderline. And it is told from her perspective, and sometimes you can't really see the subtext, because the subtext is her invention. But I think that essentially, I think the hidden, let's say, pretext of the actual pretext in the story of Medea is that her husband essentially resented and left her because uh, not because she was rejected first, but because uh, uh, as it were, she had higher standards of she wasn't being catered to in all of her desires and expectations, and the story of her life seemed like it had something that could be further served if she essentially pronounced her general dissatisfaction or displeasure, in some sense, that she was exhibiting things in this glass house, and they weren't going away, and they and no amount of attentiveness, because essentially it's just a drive for control. And essentially, after that pattern was was ascertained by her partner. Her partner essentially left her. Uh, anyway, never mind. But that's a sort of anyway. But I was just saying that if you attack the inner child, because in some sense the inner child is just there to facilitate the glass house thing, then you start seeing, let's say, the real nature of the beast, as it were. Whereas if you try to attack the subconscious aspect, although they will try to, they actually prefer that, because although it'll be exhausting to them and they'll create a lot of chaos, essentially that attrition is part of their other control mechanism. Essentially, that's the strongest point that they have to rebuff um, anything that might make inroads against the real underlying structures. Okay, and then let me just, why did I make this recording? Because I wanted to talk about their behaviors in general. I guess I'm just describing their behaviors. So the ego function. I was going to say some other general things. Damn, I lost my train of thought when I got that phone call. Yeah, so they get flustered if their inner child program essentially gets yeah, so in some sense it's like a Venn diagram. There's firstly the actual real edifice of this whole personality disorder is just the ego function, and then it's the ego function combined with the inner child, which as a Venn circle in closing, that is like the prime unit in some sense, and then the secondary unit is that same inner child, but then sort of encapsulated with the subconscious. And so they have a kind of split seat of consciousness between these two things, and that's not a de facto split. That's just a kind of, that's the ostensible split. So that's in terms of when you're dealing with them, that's the split that they want you to sort of, which is not the same thing as splitting, but essentially they want you to consider them as essentially the insulating shield is that the inner child and the subconscious is the prime unit, when it's actually the ego function and the inner child that is actually the prime unit of this disorder. Um, and you must remember that the inner child is it has been encapsulated, is a replica inner child of the ego function, and then the ego, and then that inner child, that replica of the inner child itself has its replica of a subconscious. Okay, so it's got this sort of umbrella, and as I said, that's why you're dealing sometimes with defunct inner child valences, because you're dealing with an inner child valence that's just because you've just conquered it, you've just actually refuted it, you've just actually dealt with it, and you've exhausted it, and then suddenly it's replaced by another one. Suddenly there's another inner child program that just comes in to take its place. And they've got 5 of them. And in some sense, they're not even there. They're there just to cycle between each other. They're there to facilitate the next one. They're not even there to facilitate themselves. it's betwixt them. It's in the pattern betwixt them that they are actually producing the effects that they so wish. That they are producing the manipulation. The manipulation is not even in the valences themselves. It's often between the valences themselves. It's the pattern of the sequential deployment of them. Okay. And essentially, this can only be understood in reference to the ego function, in terms of how I've already defined its actual purveying its actual purveying faculties. Um, it's playing with the references, and it can only play. And essentially, when someone is playing with references, it is itself a that is what we come to know as psychopathy. That is the manifestation of that we really label psychopathy. Um, Now, actual psychopaths, in some sense, have two sets of books. They have their private set of books, which are in slight disarray, but are at least there is some authenticity as to a state of those books. And then there's the public book, which they will show to other people, which you can say is a forgery, a fabrication in some sense. Now, that is why we call them psychopaths, is because there's inconsistency in the external set of books. It's just a pure fabrication. It's just there to look good from some angles and to do whatever the psychopath needs it to function as in order to facilitate. The borderline follows that same abstract criteria that I just laid out. In some sense, it's just that the thing that they're dealing in or dealing with is just like far more convoluted, and it's using convolution itself as part of an internally mapped medium in order to orchestrate it. So in some sense, the psychopath is willing to step outside of their own structure in some sense. They're willing to step outside of their ego function and outside of their ego function replica of the inner child in order to go mess with other people's subconscious minds. The psychopath will do that. The borderline, in some sense, does the inverse of that. They have created a false subconscious experience and they are inviting you in. So, in some sense, it's a form of psychopathy that, in some sense, because they actually have a contraption that simulates the subconscious, whereas a psychopath doesn't have a contraption that simulates the subconscious. They just see it from the outside and are capable of emulating it and playing at it and actually authentically being a player at it in some sense, even though they don't have their own subconscious integrity, as it were. So they share that. So the psychopath and the borderline share that characteristic, that they don't have a subconscious integrity, but the borderline has a more sophisticated mechanism of generating their subconscious emulation, although, as I said before, it's not an emulation, it's more of a simulation which they're inviting other people to join or to get hooked in on and to get enveloped by and to get swallowed by. So okay, now why did I also wanted to say something more about therapy. um, Okay, now I think I did actually clear up everything that I wanted to clear up, because I wanted to clear up the thing about the psychopath in terms of how they relate to the subconscious in contradistinction to the borderline, and it is it is like the framework is basically the same, but because the structure of the borderline is a particularly distinct sort of thing, it does sort of it's not. I mean, it's obvious why it hasn't been picked up as a prime psychopathology. Um, Sorry, let me not say psychopathology, that's a different word. Why it's not been defined or understood to be like full blown psychopathy, but with just essentially an interior um, subconscious um, subconscious element. Which is by its very nature incredibly unstable and needs somebody else in order to stabilize it. It needs a propitiating service, a butler, or it needs to be catered to externally in order to sort of because in essence it probably wants to have a more stable virtual inner child. It might, within the inner child's subconscious Venn diagram unit, there might be a whole series of insights there which are, just as confabulated and locked away as, for example, analogously, the narcissist's transient ego function that sort of, comes into view when the context, when the planets are aligned, and the particular sandbox and the particular state of the drama of the sandbox sort of has comes back around to the same configuration, which it learns that there's a certain meta subtextual pattern which then sort of unlocks this transient ego function, which then sort of shows itself to guide the narcissistic action in essentially a psychopathic insight, because essentially then they're using the ego function to order their subconscious mask, or to model their subconscious mask, or to reconcile their subconscious mask, or revise it, or sort of give them a sort of a further plotting point to help triangulate a bit of, because in some sense, the pure narcissist of I never described this in this set of videos, but I didn't upload this, but when you get very, very young people, I don't want to get into this right now. I had an earlier recording where I was basically talking about, I was commenting on something that Richard Grannon said, and I was making some general political cultural points, and then I got into a tangent when I spoke about that very, very young people that are narcissistic, and I mean like 4-year-olds that are like pure narcissists. And in some sense, the reason why I call them a pure narcissist is because they actually don't have a subconscious, but they have full purview over the subconscious from the inner child. And in that state, they have a really secondary naive ego function. This is when you get this very self-assured, self-considered, this is depicted very well in South Park episodes where they have the kindergartners, when the kindergartners are actually seen to be the most vicious kind of people. Even the middle schoolers are afraid of the kindergartners because their hearts are dark. That's the kind of because they're so sharp, they're so cutting. You can see this also in aspects, in elements when the kindergartners are playing video games and watching PewDiePie videos. That they don't yet have a foot of any kind of presence of having a seat of consciousness in their subconscious. They are just purely inner child, but they do see the whole container of the subconscious. And because they can fathom the whole space, the whole breadth the whole the field of possibility of the paradigm of the subconscious, and yet they haven't stepped into it. They can pervade it in such a way, also so as to, in a very obtuse kind of way, encapsulate a kind of a very sort of naive secondary indirect ego function as well. And in some sense, the reason why I call them pure narcissists is because they actually achieve the narcissistic ideal in some sense. That they have a kind of perfected vanity, but something about their ego function. I mean, it's wrong to almost say that they have an ego function. In some sense, they perfectly have a blank ego function. In some sense, the thing that makes narcissists look weak and ill-defined and incoherent is essentially the fact that they either look like idiots because they don't have the suave of the psychopath, or they look delusional because essentially the fact that they aren't being as masterful as a psychopath would be is conspicuous, and the kinds of gaps that they leave in their wake and the kinds of incommensurate, sort of half-baked, ill-considered, sort of short-sightedness in terms of their dealing with the subconscious, the missing ego function is conspicuously missing, whereas the kind of pure narcissist that I'm describing in like the 4-year-old, they have a perfectly they don't have a presence on it's not just that they don't exercise the ego function, but they actually fully avoid it. They actually have a kind of this is kind of the wrong word, but I'm just going to use it anyway. But they have a kind of nescience that is almost a kind of foreboding. It almost implies a kind of, it's like a twinge of psychopathy in some sense, but it's not. It's definitely not psychopathy, but it's sort of, it has that potential. Um, but I mean, how can you? If someone doesn't have a foot inside the subconscious, they don't. They obviously don't have a foot inside the ego function, so they just don't have one. But it's not conspicuously absent like it is in the case of a narcissist. So that's why I call them a kind of perfect narcissist. Um, these 4-year-olds. Okay, I'm not describing this so eloquently, but anyway, what is my point? What is a 4-year-old doing? Why did I bring that up? What am I saying? I wanted to contrast this with something. I wanted to contrast it with in some senses, I think that in some way a narcissist inexorably gets sort of driven toward the thing that continues to make it look more problematic in some sense, which is the ego function. It gets sort of it gets attracted to the flame of the ego function, which in some sense the transient psychopathy is a mild sort of treatment of that alluring condition that the narcissist is prone to. What's my point? Okay, these are interesting threads, but let me just find why I was going into the 4-year-old. This probably had to do with triangulating, the triangulation within the borderline. Yeah, I was going to say, I think I've said this before in this very recording, that essentially the issue with the structure of the borderline is that it's comprehensively weaving a pattern that the final product of which is a kind of subconscious impression that it's making for somebody else to be ensnared by, for somebody else to sort of be locked into. And that's why it's capable of perpetrating so much on itself, because what it does to itself is like a storehouse of what somebody else will have to answer to in the future. And the inner child aspect of this borderline structure is built on that premise. It's built on that promise, and the person who is the guarantor of that promise is the psychopathic ego function, which is the substrate. So the ego function sort of provides the law of the land, and then the inner child is the sort of it's a horrible analogy. Anyway, well, is acting on the basis of that rule set, of that framing rule set, and so it calibrates those rules into its operating system. And if the inner child aspect feels any kind of frustration, which it obviously will, it's meant to wreak havoc, it's meant to seek reconciliation and satisfaction for that using its own subconscious sub-process. So in some sense, it's up to the inner child to sort of seek remedy for its own loss in the system. And essentially, it's only the ego function that is meant to underwrite the general rules. And so in some sense, that's why they feel so hard done by when people essentially get into a patterned, let's say, cultural almost set of ingredients, which then they expected that they should have then be able to reliably depend on on that continuation of that set of laid down sort of things. Oh, I just said something so vague, but when they find a modus operandi which then seems to be commensurate with their ego function, they feel really hard done by when they lose their continued source of narcissistic supply for their inner child, but it's based essentially on the framework itself being thrown into question. And then essentially, all they can do is just continually get their inner child to manufacture more alluring subconscious bait, essentially, and bribery and quid pro quo. And because that's the solution to everything, because they should never have to, that they've the reason why they created this in the first place is that they never have to do anything else. There's nothing else that can't be accomplished, essentially. That was the promise of this personality disorder, is that it could do anything. It has the potential of getting its levers to control anything through the kind of vicarious amalgamation and agglomeration. The merger of subconscious. And yes, they can cycle through their inner child programs, and they can even craft an inner child program specifically for someone, and they can even try to sort of reorder it or whatever, or recalibrate it or create a new pantheon. Or generally, I think they generally don't. I think they work out prime categories within their inner child programs, and they learn how to use those instruments, and they usually don't. They're usually set on an evolutionary course, which you can say is very unique and specific. Because in some sense, it's not about the individual programs. It's about how they pass off to one another, how they interrelate, because the manipulation happens in the cycling between them, not in their individual deployment, but in their combined deployment, and the sequential cycling, and how essentially you can use the sequential cycling to, it's like in the same way that if you just have three primary colors, you can make all the other colors. That's what they've done. They've made primary colors out of a virtual inner child, and they use that to paint their own internal canvassed holding cell, and now they just need to populate it with a living being to be enslaved and entranced. Then they can use that person to sort of leverage all the internal stress of these structures into a more fruitful, subversive, enslaved pandering, which it will basically call sympathy. So this is why, you can actually, it's hard to know. Look, there's a lot of confusion in borderline because it uses confusion, it leverages confusion. But essentially, if you just abstract it down enough, you can see the persistent patterns. It's just sympathy. It's just control and sympathy. That's essentially it, Is a kind of conceptual captivation based on a kind of sympathy-driven, impulsive weird kind of compatriotism as well. Anyway, I've exhausted myself talking about this topic, but yeah, I guess that's some new things. Maybe I'm going to stop making these recordings. I need to move on to other projects. But I almost wanted to say, it's when I start hearing Sam Vaknin speak, I'm starting to think that he's talking about me when he talks about self-styled experts. I never used to think that those epithets were directed at me. Um, I don't know why I'm feeling. Perhaps he's saying the quality of my work is not as it once was in his surveillance of it, but maybe I'm just being overly sensitive. But I mean, I don't want to say nasty things, especially when I'm speculating as to defending myself. But anyway, there are a lot of things I could say, and I think it's quite obvious. No, let me not say horrible, conceited things. Um, I'll just stop the recording. But I should actually try to extract what I said about Richard Grannon. It was not a comment on Richard Grannon. It was a comment on some of the substance that Richard Grannon was talking about, and I felt like I was making a point that does need to be made, and it's more of a general point as well, a political, cultural sort of point. But it has to do about refining this culture of directness and confrontation, and not essentially being giving into this culture of sympathy, which in some sense I think is the exacerbator of the psychopathy. And I was just picking up on some themes where I think that in some sense Richard Grannon, although substantively he's sort of on point, I think in terms of his style he is actually, what's the word? He's not being as efficient as he could be, let's just say, in surmounting and confronting. And that's because essentially I think he's trying to proselytize too widely. But anyway, I've got a whole recording on that, but the problem is that some of that substance is combined with recordings on other things as well, which are really bad quality recordings. I probably will upload it all in one go and just say it's an embarrassing diatribe about many different things. But there are also some other good tangents in there, which I do actually want to upload it. Just some of those recordings are embarrassing because the quality is quite low, and perhaps I get grandiose a bit as well. The style in the last recording was regrettable in its disjointedness. But anyway, I'm going to. I've now remembered the sort of the the topic that I wanted to bring up, that I didn't explore properly. Although I'm trying to append that gap. Okay, so the thing that I didn't get into was essentially because the borderline has got this very complicated tower of sophisticated virtual emulation, which has sort of two stages where they're emulating an inner child, and then that inner child is emulating its own subconscious, uh, as also a kind of joint sort of thing, in some sense that the only thing that is stable in this structure is not the content, but it's the style. So this is why they seem very manipulative. It's very obvious that they are manipulative because at some point they encourage people over a prolonged exposure to ignore the content of what they're saying and just to sort of see the pattern, see the recurring underlying thematic influence, as it were. And so you've got this, essentially, you get this very brittle kind of engagement where they are um, where you're dealing with a certain subject matter, you're dealing with a certain content, and then suddenly the content completely gets thrown out the window and replaced with new content. And the new content is essentially bringing to bear the same style of enforcement, the same unilateral exposition. Um, and in some sense, they don't have a safe and stable bond unless they've gotten someone who is essentially capitulating to this meta attrition in some sense, where essentially their end game is that they are trying to acclimatize people towards their ego function. They're trying to essentially, they want in some sense to stop using the inner child and essentially to just use their ego function directly. And that's why I keep on mentioning the sort of their end game transition is towards a house of mirrors. The house of mirrors subconscious realm in which the other person in some sense then the real asymmetry from the level of the ego function then fully comes into clear resolution, when in some sense other people must be stable identities that they can plot on their chessboard, on their ego function chessboard, and maneuver around, let's say, the dictation of that narrative of the chessboard, and then essentially then the asymmetry in the real topography, in the actual terrain of reality, which they're not interested in, that's for the other person to care about, that they can essentially use that chessboard to force them into confronting the battles and the expectations, and heralding the greed of their ego function. So in some sense, their greed of their ego function becomes essentially a moral necessity for their target, for their host, that is being plotted onto this chessboard. So other people have to be stable identities, while they want other people to be conditioned essentially to just sort of to take their cues from their ego function that slowly wants to unmask itself as just a kind of unilateral flow of exhibition of their internal monologue. So essentially, they don't want a dialogue. They want someone who's just absorbing, is just receiving the messages and having to open them and explore them, and they will help them to explore the messages that they send. But they have no other interest. They have no other query. They're not interested in delving into any other issue unless they essentially set it up, unless it's fertile ground for helping them in entrench their host into the culture of what I generally refer to as the House of Mirrors. And so the House of Mirrors is a more complicated form of like psychopathic attachment, in that they have invested their integrity, but in some sense it's more imperative for a borderline because of the sophistication of the instruments that they are habituated into using, and so they want to transition into, let's say, the more stable psychopathic arrangement, which I would call the House of Mirrors thing. So in some sense, they are, I think, the let's say the more successful borderlines, the one they do reach a certain stability, they do reach a certain consistency. It's just that consistency and that stability comes at the cost of their host, comes at the cost of their victim, essentially, that has to essentially make their identity prostrate to this collective accountability or this exterior accountability. And so essentially they only operate if they can sort of fluidly apportion blame according to their ego function. If their ego function has been given full permission and, let's say, full accessibility into being able to apportion blame freely, then you really are living in a house of mirrors. because there's no such thing as reality. There's no such thing as a persistent context. The because essentially they dictate unilaterally the subtext of everything, and the pretext is just window dressing. It doesn't matter at all. That sort of they cycle. So in some sense, their willful psychopathic treatment of the pretext of anything, their inconsistent treatment of the pretext of any situation, um, they essentially they solve their whole inner child convolution by essentially just blanketly denying the 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 validity of pretext itself. Pretext essentially becomes a non-issue. So, but in some sense, they need the person that they're attached to in order to sort of to clean up the issues that the pretext has. So they need someone who is capable of enough to sort of compartmentalize the kind of the codependent unit with the borderline and the ancillary issues which the borderline want swept under the rug in terms of their relationship to their host, but that the other person essentially must just sort of figure out the logistics, must sort of just seamlessly make that fantasy, that delusional house of mirrors, must keep it a kind of safe space in order to allow the ego function to be unfiltered and to be direct, because then at least it can be direct and it doesn't have to go through the glass house exhibitionism. Essentially, the glass house exhibitionism is in some sense um, the inferior mode, or the less preferred mode, but essentially even the glass house mechanism is part of this gradient scale of decompartmentalization and eroding the other person's ego function into being a kind of, in some sense, they need the other person's ego function to be codependent with their subconscious contribution, which they want to fully construct as a house of mirrors, um, as a kind of, so they own the subconscious container that captivates the other person's, that attaches onto the other person's subconscious. But the reason why they want that is essentially because they need a separate ego function that is on the hook to them, but is conditioned to not merge their ego function. So they need a separate pool of accountability to pollute in order in order to sustain their kind of their weird moral rationalization of their own system. But then they need practical work done as well to facilitate that weird union that they have created, which also has this sort of thing on the outside of it, which is the other person's ego function that has to sort of skulk around and work in the shadows and be the sort of the hidden hand. Yeah, it hurts my mind just going through. I know I'm not going very slowly and I'm just sort of glancing over it, but that's pretty much all of the bullshit. Okay, so okay, I think that is the whole matter now. And I don't really care to go through it in more detail. There are other things that I need to focus on. Okay, uh, uh, I'm going to recap some elements slightly, but there is more that I want to add onto the therapy components. because it is perhaps a very problematic juggling act, because in some sense, if you get the glove sorted out, in some sense you've contained the psychopathic toxicity to some degree. But then when you are rehabilitating this kind of borderline, or this kind of case, a borderline case that then has got the glove worked out in terms of the subconscious and the ego function, then you're dealing with, let's say, the oh damn, there was a word that I had. You're dealing with the juvenile narcissism then. So then, after you've got the glove worked out, the problem is that the glove isn't filled automatically. And then you're dealing with essentially a juvenile narcissist. And in some sense, it also bears some resemblance to my description of the 4-year-old perfect narcissist. In some sense, they won't want to touch the glove. They don't want anything to do with the glove, because the glove already implies to them the sense of ability or capability that they should be able to exercise with their structures meeting up with their subconscious and ego function, which has already been sort of comported into this glove sort of capacity. So in some sense, everyone else must have a perfectly articulated glove, and it must sort of treat their juvenile narcissism with a kind of kit glove type um, treatment and compunction that they are being catered to. Um, and in some sense, this is also vaguely reminiscent of the logic of the borderline structure to begin with, in some sense, where in some sense someone with this kind of juvenile narcissism, in some sense, has regressed on the borderline path to some degree, but it's still the proto borderline. It's still on the proto borderline causation track, or whatever. It still has the perfect capability of reverting back to borderline, although perhaps it won't. But essentially, it's still on the same general goal. It's still fulfilling. It's still in some sense if it can just be treated as a juvenile narcissist and be pandered to and catered to as a juvenile narcissist, then essentially they're fulfilling the same objective that the overarching borderline structure was fulfilling in the first place. Just it's doing so without discomfort to the virtual inner child. So in some sense, it's being able to get at the same objective, but not have to go through, let's say, the fracturing of the inner child, or the inner child. So essentially, all that's collapsed is the glass house, vector of exhibition in some sense, and in some sense, it's very similar to the glass house. What has come to replace it? It's just a single platform. So the glass house, in some sense, was an insulated space in which new projects or new valences of the inner child could exhibit themselves and force a reaction. There's still that there's still that glass in some sense, but it just has a singular platform of a consistent portrayer, a consistent operator. So in some sense, it's like, instead of using the glass house to forward these acting roles that are being scripted, now it's just a single script, a single narrative. It's just a unit. So in some sense, it's like, uh, in some sense, the cloud of the psychotic cloud, or not psychotic, psychopathic cloud, the psychopathic cloud of the ego voice is infused into a single inner child juvenile entity, and in some sense, um, it is also sort of just portraying the inner child beliefs naively and saying, I don't have an ego cloud. I'm not manipulating anything, because I don't have a meta-analysis. I just have my pure feelings. And so you can see that this is one of the layers of so anyway, if you, even if you, let's say, you get the if you sort of get the glove constructed or steel manned or whatever, you get the glove, then you have to sort of get you have to get the juvenile narcissistic element that remains to sort of operate within that glove, and they won't want to. They'll want in some sense, the glove they will love even constructing it, because essentially they can impose that on other people. In some sense, that is the subconscious role that other people must play in relation to them, but they don't track themselves meeting up to that standard. They only use it externally in some sense. So it's still this one-way vector of control in some sense. And so in some sense, they're still exactly the same. So they need a kind of, now you see again, this is problematic, because any description I say, they can essentially latch onto it and use. But they need a uh, they need a nurturing environment, but that is not an environment that is made by other people. They need to impose on themselves, you know, the nurturing environment in which they are capable of burdening this responsibility of being contrasted with the glove, as it were. And again, you know, they're just locked into their unilateral um, essentially, I mean, the biggest problem is how do you uh, re rehabilitate a juvenile narcissist that has in the past developed a completely autistic, self-insulating, you know, full-on psychopathic um, control, or structure of control. You know, so that it's like, in some sense, a good way of picturing this is that they've created within their psychopathic structure a totem, literally a totem pole, and that totem pole is constructed out of at different inner child valences, and then above those inner child valences, different glass house exhibitions, and it's sort of and it's stacked in that way, and that totem pole is how they relate to reality, is just the totem pole. That's what makes them psychopathic, is that they can just channel the different faces on the different sides of the totem pole, and they can just sort of channel a different facet of it, and in some sense it's all the same machine, it's all the same thing. Now if you can sort of reforge that totem pole into a glove, and then they've got this idea that essentially there's some ideal in terms of how an ego function and a subconscious should function on a kind of, on an almost abstract general universal level, then you're still left with someone who has their whole life just been using this totem pole in order to uh, in order to compel environmental um, uh, compliance. You know, so essentially you have to sort of get them to articulate the glove, and the glove is so well formed and beyond, let's say, their capability of filling, but they still actually have to force themselves to interact with others through the glove, not around the glove, not you know. So they have to stop averting themselves from facilitating. So although they might not be able to fill the glove perfectly, and although they might not have the delicate nuance or whatever, they still have to actually use the glove, and that requires a kind of nurturing allowance of themselves to be imprecise or to be wrong, or to, you know, because in some sense part of the construction of the glove is that the glove has an ability essentially to apologize and to revise itself and to rename itself and recharacterize itself, but still keep an active responsibility, um, an active ontological responsibility for recording that that sequence of events, as it were, and that is subconscious work, and they don't, I guess, want to do the work. They don't want any subconscious work. The juvenile narcissist is still essentially doing whatever it wants. It is a force of nature. Everything else just has to sort of corral itself and conform to the space in which the juvenile narcissist is exerting its pure feelings and its pure sentiments, and everything else must just sort of perfectly symmetrically reflect and mirror that purity, or sort of make it very obvious if the narcissist is going to get its way or not. Okay, and it's very insufferable to have to sort of be exposed to that kind of thing, especially when it's sort of, it isn't dealing through the glove, but then it's sort of, it actually almost psychopathically has got these brittle heuristics that the only thing built into those heuristics is essentially just guaranteeing the insulation and the preordained preeminence of the psychopathic, or of the juvenile narcissistic beliefs, which are not capable of being revised, which are not capable of being vulnerable or susceptible to any kind of invalidation. So they are what they are, and they can never change what they are. And so essentially, it's sort of put up or shut up. It's that kind of psychopathic treatment in some sense. Even as they tell story, and this is why they are so entrenched in narrative. This is why essentially they can only communicate through portraying this narrative in some sense. The only difference is that maybe they're not cycling through as many narratives. They've got a singular narrative now. So this kind of juvenile narcissist, in some sense, is slightly better than the borderline because it's got a singular narrative, but it still has all the corrosive features of it. It still, in some overarching sense, is not any different from the borderline pathology. It's just in a slightly more internally stable thing. And essentially, it's stabilized by having this glove construct in some sense, that it has sort of fixed to a very high degree a kind of a definition of the ego function and the subconscious in relation to each other. But essentially, because this is an external judgment which is being projected onto other people, that means that they can imagine that they can plot other people and they can maneuver other people in the same chess playing sort of psychopathic chess playing demon fashion, and then they can essentially relate to people with a singular juvenile narcissistic valence and not have to cycle through reinventing themselves. But essentially, if that method will probably at some point offer the same level of frustration, if it seems as if it might work, or if they can assuage that frustration by essentially reverting, then they'll revert. So in some sense, they're still in the greed mode. They're still in essentially the knee-jerk sense of control. They are just obsessed with control. They're psychopathic. Yeah, in some sense, this is, I think, the only way to abstractly really understand what borderline is. In some sense, psychopaths are psychopathic because they're inconsistent to other people in relation to not holding up a kind of, they don't have any good faith in terms of their ego function. That's the best way to understand it. Their stated objectives are not held up. They're quite hollow deceptions, as it were. But in some sense, a psychopath, that's that let's say thematic behavior about a psychopath is incidental. They're not interested in being inconsistent. They just happen to also be inconsistent because it's inconsequential to them. Consistency to other people, to other people's subconscious, is irrelevant to them. In some sense, you can say it's because they have an utter disregard and what's the word? They have structures in their virtual inner child and their ego function that effectively has completely supplanted the significance of subconscious. So feeling bodies or masks or whatever are utterly irrelevant. In some sense, in some metaphysical sense, they're like a kind of autist. So it doesn't matter what other people have on their masks in some sense, because the politics and diplomacy and negotiation of masks uh, doesn't have anything in relation to their belief structure, doesn't have anything to do with their inner child, because they have essentially a virtual inner child, which is being emulated by their ego function. So their ego function, in some sense, is just like metaphysically autistic. So their inconsistency in how they relay that ego function to other people is just incidentally irrelevant. It just doesn't matter. So consistency is anyway. So that's what makes them psychopathic, is that is that essentially that intrinsic bad faith that they have, not because they are actively perpetrating bad faith, but because they have no interest in good faith. So they incidentally produce bad faith on the level of their ego function. Now, borderlines, in some sense, are also psychopathic in the sense that they are inconsistent, because essentially it's always rules for thee but not for me. Essentially, so when they produce this glove, the glove is in some sense, instead of having, in some sense, part of that totem pole has been truncated, and essentially they're still regarding something like a totem pole, but instead of the totem pole, everyone else in their chess playing chessboard, all the other pieces are wearing the gloves, but they're not wearing the gloves. They don't wear the gloves. Everyone else wears the gloves, and because somehow they're still pervading the chessboard like a narcissist. It's still their sandbox, and it's only their sandbox. It's their model. Um, it's just that the glass house, in some sense, has been replaced by, instead of them switching out their chess piece of themselves into, oh, suddenly I'm this player and I can do these moves, and suddenly I'm a different player that can do different moves. Instead of doing that, they've just bound everyone with these gloves, and but they don't wear the gloves. So there's still an asymmetry. So that asymmetry is still psychopathic, essentially, um, because they're immune to recognizing that meta-analysis, as it were, um, that epistemological thread. They have a kind of juvenile narcissistic nescience about what's going on in their ego function. Um, and again, I would say that that's because essentially the psychopathic substrate is immediately at work in generating now a stable. So in some sense, they've become a kind of a stable psychopath. Uh, um, well, I mean, psychopaths are already relatively quite stable relative to borderlines. Um, Obviously, not a psychopath that it's in a kind of doom spiral because they've invested something into the subconscious game, and then they've got something to lose, and their integrity has been threatened, or the integrity of their structure of their ego function and in virtual inner child has been threatened by a kind of expedition that they had in the subconscious, where they had very little to gain, but now they've sort of been entracted into a kind of a thread of they're prone to the sunk fallacy cost, in essence, but in terms of whatever expedition they do in terms of the subconscious. But anyway, which then also sort of, anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. But anyway, what I'm saying about the borderline is that what was I saying? That they're still psychopathic. Oh, damn, what was that thread? That the inner child, the naive narcissism. Damn, what was I just talking about? Okay, yeah, the essentially the inner child of now of the stabilized borderline in some sense, or at least the stabilized inner child of this borderline, or the stabilized valence, is essentially, in some sense, they are slightly more sophisticated than psychopaths, because, as I said, psychopaths are incidentally inconsistent. about their ego function, whereas borderlines are actually consistent about their ego function. That consistency is leveraging control and manipulation, essentially, and coercion, which is why that asymmetry even exists, where they have given the gloves to other people and they're not wearing them themselves. And this is, again, this is the dimension in which, this is the only dimension in which there will ever be improvement. Is can Because essentially the gloves gives them some measure, some scope of being able to simulate a narrative that's issued from their ego function, which sounds like that it holds accountability. That sounds like it can actually sort of have stable reality in terms of what it's accounting. It at least has a consistent thread of narrative. I would still say that it's very what the content is still quite delusional in some sense, because there's no active responsibility. That so essentially it's still compiling bullshit. It's still compiling very weak reality tested material that is essentially being made mostly out of convenience, specious interpretation, convenient selective contextual manufacturing. There's a lot of fabrication going on. There's a lot of in the same way that I believe narcissists confabulate. You've got that kind of because essentially now you're dealing with a kind of, although the substrate is still psychopathic, and it's even more than psychopathic because it's control orientated. So psychopaths aren't necessarily obsessed with control, although I guess they can get into that bind. But in some sense, the borderline is persistently in that mode of needing, in some sense, because they are out to get this kind of asymmetrical. They're out to get away with this kind of asymmetrical. They need something to ground that asymmetrical chessboard, as it were, because there's something about the chessboard. Psychopaths don't necessarily have this chessboard. That again, it's this kind of, that's an incidental expression of the structure between the ego function and the inner child, whereas the borderline, in some sense, needs to have a plotted point on the subconscious. In some sense, that's incidental to a normal psychopath. To an ordinary psychopath, the subconscious is just completely an incidental feature that they might become interacted with, in one of their adventures to the kiddies pool, because it's all just a kiddies pool to them. They are an expert diver, but there are no Olympic-sized swimming pools that they can go to. There are only kiddies pools. And so, and if they go on an expedition and then they get someone gets their goad, someone goads them into being entracted into some drama or whatever, then they're invested, then they're obsessive perhaps, because they have to try to sort of reclaim the verification of the supremacy of their structures, which exist in a reflective state. In some sense, the borderline is automatically invested into the subconscious. They need, or maybe they just want to have an effect there. They want to have a reach into it, and the only way to have a safe way to reach into it is to have a conduit that can effectively absorb all the stress, because they don't want to have anything other than an asymmetrical relationship. So in some sense, it's kind of like a militant solipsism. That is always on the lookout for a kind of redundancy in order to guarantee the solipsism. So in some sense, it's like they have really committed themselves to play this sort of this worship of the totem pole, that the totem pole is the conduit to doing anything, and there must never be another answer. There must never be another way of doing anything. And so they can simulate many things, but essentially it's very hard for them to abstractly move from that formulaic psychopathic interface with other people, that they're not interested in dealing with other people on their terms. They're only interested in dealing with the totem pole. And they are only capable of substituting it, the totem pole, for something that is almost analogous to the totem pole, where it's a clear asymmetry, where other people are wearing the gloves and they're not wearing the gloves. Um, okay. Yeah, so this is a bit embarrassing and this is a bit raw, but I guess that's kind of, I think, the state that you're dealing with is that, again, without them ever generating the motivation to have active responsibility and epistemic accountability. uh, I mean, in some sense, the gloves that I was talking about was not the gloves that I was originally talking about, because in some sense, the gloves that I was originally talking about are not other people's gloves. They are your own gloves. It is the gloves made out of your own ego function and your own subconscious. And so, in some sense, if the borderline makes these gloves but then doesn't wear them, or doesn't ever see them as their instruments to use, and essentially transposes that and projects that onto other people, then they didn't make the gloves in the first place. And so, the gloves are essentially, it has to come all at once, and this is the stepping stone. I think you don't get any tangible progress at all for a borderline until they have this motivation, this internally sourced decision, essentially, to actively have responsibility and actively contend accountability simultaneously. But instead, they will always just only do the one. And essentially, by doing that, they can always just keep on playing the same iteration of just another variant of the same deceptive, manipulative, coercive bullshit. And yeah, I mean, it's just, it's annoying because it's sort of, that's all it ever is. It just, and it can create an endless amount of iterations of saying the same thing. Um, that it's very good at mimicking whatever criteria is being sort of told. It's being given of what it needs to do. It's very good at mimicking that criteria by merely just emulating it through one of those two things, through either being accountable but not actively responsible, or being actively responsible and then the accountability is like is the reset button is pushed on that, so you never get these things occurring simultaneously. um, and so essentially it's always using identity essentially to shield it, the concept of identity itself to shield itself, and therefore it never actually has a stable subconscious mask, as it were, that has any fidelity to the ego function. um, and I would call this a form of, I mean, this is psychological bad faith, essentially. uh, and in some sense I think this is because essentially the lust dimension of psychological reality in the metatype 17 model corresponds to the 13th dimension. So they're they have this unlimited sense of um, being able. Okay, this is a tangent, but anyway, uh, they essentially, there's no limit to the abuse on the concept of faith that they can engineer. It's an inexhaustible, unlimited resource for them to and in some, let me just think, because wait, when I was doing my, so that would be, yeah, and trust, I guess, as well. Trust, I mean, like, yeah, so I'm just trying to think, when I was doing my personal therapy on my personality style, which helped me, I worked out a way to sort of clear up some dimensions which really help control a lot of issues. And just using that therapy pattern, if borderlines are metatype 14s, then that would correspond the same issue that I went through. Mainly dealt with two dimensions, sort of dimension 7 and 8. So for them, and I'm a metatype 13, so if they're a metatype 14, then they would have to deal with 8 and 9. Anyway, but also or yeah, 8 and 9, so they would have to deal with 9 and 10. And dimension 10 is trust, extroverted thinking. So I mean, I guess yeah, they're very aberrated probably on. I get the thing that you have to sort of work with, and the thing where a lot of the aberration occurs on is not always necessarily exactly the same. But anyway, this actually corresponds much more with this other recording that I'm making about my theory. But anyway, let me just end this. And I think this will finally end on my discussion on borderline.